Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Thursday, May the 18th. You're tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thanks for joining. It is almost the end of the week for me. Tonight's the last show. As you know, I'm only doing shows Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And on Sunday nights, I do a joint show, the Nick and Joe Show, with my good friend and yours, even though you probably don't really know him that much, Nick Vandergrat, who is out on the West Coast now, as I've mentioned before. Anyway, I don't do shows on Friday nights because it happens to be my Sabbath, Saturday night, or Friday night to Saturday night, being Orthodox Jewish. So, and I don't generally do a show. I could have a pre-taped show, but I don't want to give people the impression that I'm doing something that would otherwise not be permitted for me. Okay, so what's in the news today? Before we get into the news, or before we do that, I just want to let you know that we're going to be talking tonight about drugs and the BC drug policy, the opioid epidemic, which apparently is not an opioid epidemic, now experts are saying, but the BC government, of course, having managed to convince the federal government to institute or allow a waiver for criminal prosecutions of possession of dangerous drugs, etc. So it's now been 3 months into that program, 4 months into that program, and I just thought that it was probably not a bad idea to revisit things, see how things are going there, especially in light of some reports coming out of some medical reports, corridor reports, etc. So we're going to get into that, but of course, as always, before we do that, I thought we should spend a little bit of time going over some of the headlines, some of the things that are making news today that I thought that you'd be interested in. First thing is that the Alberta election is coming up soon, and tonight there's a debate. So after we're done this show, you can run, well, you're probably catching me on the internet, so you could probably find a live stream of the leaders' debate in Alberta. Things are looking, I don't know if grim is the right word for either political party. They're running pretty much neck and neck. And today, some unfortunate news broke for the sitting premier, Danielle Smith, the ethics commissioner investigating her communications with the Attorney General and with an accused pastor in Alberta, Arthur Pawlowski, who is facing charges for having violated some of the restrictions around his church during the COVID epidemic, so-called COVID epidemic. Really what that was more was an epidemic in government control, so we can call it the government control COVID-inspired government control epidemic is probably a more accurate way of putting it. And anyway, Pastor Pawlowski was charged with having violated a number of the rules that were put in place in Alberta at that time. And when Danielle Smith became premier, or when she was running to become the leader of the party, the UCP, which is effectively what made her the premier of Alberta, because the UCP is the government in Alberta. So what ended up happening is she talked to him, she discussed this and a couple of other cases, probably with the Attorney General as well, and the ethics commissioner, notwithstanding the fact that actually nothing happened as a result of any of these discussions, however detailed they were or not detailed, notwithstanding the fact that nothing happened from them, the Attorney General took no action, no judge was called, no prosecuting attorney was interfered with. So nothing really happened, but the ethics commissioner is saying that the premier broke ethic rules around this. And in his report, he makes mention of the fact that the Attorney General must have felt under tremendous pressure for fear that he might lose his position as Attorney General. honestly, if he felt that kind of pressure and he was considering, if I don't do something, I'm going to lose my position. If that was part of the calculation, I'm not sure that this particular person is qualified to be the Attorney General. To me, it's a no-brainer. You could talk, if I was the Attorney General, talk to me all you want. I don't feel any pressure. I'm going to do what I have to do. And I don't care whether I get fired or not. I'm not going to change my mind or feel pressured to break rules in order to save my position as Attorney General. I would resign first. So it just seems to me that is what a person of integrity would do in a case like that. So I'm not really sure that I get what the ethics commissioner is trying to say. But in any event, whatever happened is purely theoretical, hypothetical, esoterical even. It didn't happen. There was no pressure put on. There was no change in anybody's behavior. So I just don't get what the problem here is. On top of that, and I've mentioned this before, and I'm going to say it again, there is a reason why our political establishment, our elected leaders, I should say, political establishment sounds kind of negative, but there is a reason why our elected leaders are in charge of the police and the prosecutions. We do have an independent judicial system. But whether or not we decide to charge someone with a crime, ultimately, that's a choice. Once a person has been charged with a crime, then the judiciary ought to have complete independence to determine whether or not that person has actually broken the law. But there are several types of prosecutions that aren't allowed to go forward without some oversight on the part of the elected establishment, the government. And I think that's the way we want it. We want the government to be able to step in and say, we want our elected officials to be able to step in and say, this is wrong. Okay? That our police, just like our military, work under civilian control. And that implies oversight. And yes, we do have civilian oversight. We have these bodies and commissions, etc. But ultimately, the responsibility lies with our elected officials. So I don't see an ethical violation here just because a discussion happened. If a discussion happened and the government decided to stay the prosecution, that is to say the Attorney General decided to stay the prosecution, then that would raise questions. And we would then have a discussion about it, an inquiry and investigation to determine whether or not the government had, the Attorney General had done something wrong. But in this case, he didn't do anything. And I just don't have a problem with the discussion being held. Because ultimately, again, how do you police the police if you're not willing to have a discussion amongst the people who are responsible for policing the police about whether or not the police have acted reasonably, or whether or not the law under which Pastor Pawlowski, or anyone else for that matter, is a just and sensible law. Of course these discussions have to go on. And we shouldn't be putting the fear of God into anybody for having those discussions. That is their responsibility. So I don't see an ethical violation here at all. I'm sure that she broke some written rules somewhere along the lines, but those rules, those very rules, are what the problem is. The rules that say you cannot have this discussion amongst yourself, that's wrong. What else is happening out there? Gas prices, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, he's estimating that gas prices are going to rise as much as 17 cents a litre under Ottawa's new clean fuel rules. 17 cents a litre, ladies and gentlemen. To put that into perspective, that would be, 40, 28, 68, somewhere around 70 cents a gallon if we were still using the imperial system. I'm just putting that into perspective for my Americans who are listening to this show. 70 cents a gallon. Now, I'm scratching myself because my head is itchy. This isn't me just being perplexed, because I'm not perplexed about this. That kind of a sharp increase in fuel costs contributes significantly to the cost of groceries, to the increased cost of groceries, amongst other things. You cannot continue to pile on more and more and more tax on transportation, whether it's tax or it's regulation or whatever is increasing the cost of the fuel. That is a significant contributor to the rising cost of food and other items. You cannot do this without some effect, and it's quite unfortunate that people are just sort of chalking this up to the increases in prices, consumer goods, etc., particularly food, that are just chalking up to this mysterious sort of nebulous idea of inflation, as if inflation just exists out there independent of any kind of government policy. This isn't actually true, real inflation. This has nothing to do with the devaluation of the currency or any other things that have to do with actual core inflation. This is just straight up government policy increasing the cost of producing and transporting food between the farm and the grocery store. You figure it out. Deputy police chief in Windsor fined for stunt driving. Okay, now everybody's going to say, good. Why should the deputy police chief be above the law? And indeed, why should he be above the law? So this is what typically happens when you're caught going more than 40 kilometers per hour over the speed limit, if the speed limit is under 80 kilometers per hour. Okay? Typically, you get an automatic 30-day driver's license suspension. Typically, you get a 14-day vehicle impoundment and a minimum fine, typically, of $2,000. The deputy police chief in Windsor was fined, after pleading guilty, how much? $350. $352, actually. $287 in fines, plus court costs. Meanwhile, a constable in Windsor was ordered to work 80 hours for free. 80 hours for free because he donated $50 to the Freedom Convoy last year. I'm trying to wrap my mind around that. Is that like a double standard or what, ladies and gentlemen? 80 hours times what his normal hourly wage would be. I don't know what they make in the police in Windsor. $25, $30, $35 an hour. Let's just say $30 an hour, just to make the math easy. 80 times 30 is, do the math, $2,400. So here is this constable who donated to a political cause that wasn't hurting anybody, $50, and he is fined effectively $2,400. Effectively, that's what the fine is for him. His boss, the deputy police chief, does something that actually endangers lives, and he gets fined $352, and that includes the court costs. You know, is it any wonder that people are losing their faith in the system when that happens? Oh, in international news, not a lot going on. Actually, there is a lot going on, but I see that Disney is scrapping plans for a new Florida campus. And according to the headline here, this is being attributed to the fact that they're in this fight with Governor Ron DeSantis over a number of things. They're suing him, he's suing them. It's a real dog's breakfast right now going on between the government in Florida and Disney. But I would like to point out to you that Disney, for a number of months now, has been shutting down all kinds of displays and programs not having anything to do with the dispute that's going on between it and Governor DeSantis. So when you see that Disney's having these problems, don't think that it has anything to do with DeSantis and the ongoing feud between those two people, or the entity of Disney and Ron DeSantis. There may be that there's going to be some impact there. I don't doubt that. I'm not claiming otherwise. But Disney is in trouble anyway, notwithstanding whatever's going on between it and the Florida governor. Okay? And I think that that's because, like so much of the woke crowd out there, they have gone way overboard. And there are a lot of common sense people out there who aren't going to march in the streets. They aren't going to protest, but they're just not going to go anymore. They're going to go, enough with this already. It's enough already. All you have to do is look at the example of Anheuser-Busch and Bud Light. People are not running around protesting in the streets. They're just not buying the beer anymore. And it's caused a significant problem financially for that company. Oh, and speaking of DeSantis, according to CNN, he is expected to announce that he will be running for president officially next week sometime. So that sets up a Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump showdown for the presidential nomination of the GOP, the Republican Party in the United States. That will be interesting. That will be a very interesting fight, because while they're not running neck and neck right now among Republican voters with respect to who Republicans want to be their representative in next year's presidential race, right now Trump is head and shoulders ahead. But when you look at DeSantis up against Biden and Trump up against Biden, they both beat Biden, according to recent polling by the Washington Post. So that'll be a very interesting race. We're going to have to see what's going to happen there. All right, what else is going on? I think it's probably way past our time to take a break. So that's what we're going to do. Ladies and gentlemen, we will go for a quick break here on the Joseph Benham Show. Stick around. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Okay, we are back. Thank you for staying with us. I am Joseph Benamy, and you're listening to or watching the Joseph Benamy Show. You could be on YouTube. You could be watching Facebook Live. You could be watching on Twitter. We are on Twitter now. Just a few months ago, there was no way that a show of this kind could be on Twitter. I don't have the following of Bill O'Reilly or Tucker Carlson or any of those guys. But that actually makes it easier to knock a person like me off of the internet, or off of Twitter. Anyway, we're really happy to have the opportunity. Just getting rid of some wires here. Look at this, my goodness gracious, to be on Twitter. So as well as some other internet radio stations, and hopefully pretty soon we're going to be on some terrestrial stations as well. We're working very hard to get onto some of them as well. So anyway, I promised that we would get into a discussion a little bit around the opioid crisis in British Columbia, or the so-called opioid crisis in British Columbia, because I'm reading today some experts that are saying that it's not really an opioid crisis, it's not really an opioid epidemic, because what's happening is, because there is a shortage in British Columbia of reliable, let's call them safe opioids for addicts, and that's part of the discussion that we're going to have tonight, that people are looking for substitutes to opioids, and it's these substitutes that are quote-unquote unregulated, which is a new term that has now been introduced into the debate. But anyway, these non-opioid drugs are what's causing the epidemic of deaths. So here's the thing. As we all know, starting on January 1st, the British Columbia government, the police in British Columbia, were no longer charging people with a criminal offense for possession of drugs for personal use. And in fairness, again, just to be clear, it's not a blanket waiver. There are limits to how much you can have in your possession, and there are age restrictions as well. So it's not a blanket exemption, but it really does take away the whole criminal aspect of personal use of these drugs. It doesn't surprise me that this is not working out. Why do I say it's not working out? Well, here, just in the month of April, according to the BC coroner, 206 people died of toxic drugs. That's just in April in British Columbia. Now that represents, ladies and gentlemen, a 17% increase over the same period last year. That is to say, the 206 people who have died, we're going to be careful here, not to say that they died of overdoses. Let's just say that they died in reaction to taking toxic drugs. That may have been an overdose. It may have been something else that was mixed in that was toxic. I don't know. Of course, all of these drugs are toxic. But we're not going to call it an overdose. We'll grant them that. 17%, though, higher. That 206 people is 17% higher than the number who died last April. Okay. And since the beginning of the year, since decriminalization, 814 people are believed to have died due to, again, this is the new term that's being used, due to unregulated toxic drugs. And that's in the first 4 months of 2023. And again, that's a sharp increase from last year. So I'm waiting to hear how it is that the decriminalization And I'm not unsympathetic to the argument for decriminalization, because a criminal record follows you around for the rest of your life. And if you happen to be an addict and you get off of it, you get clean, but you have this criminal record, that could stop you from getting a job, even though you're a decent person, hardworking, honest, you've kicked the habit. You know, in some ways, I would say that you've demonstrated that your integrity and your strength of character in some ways is higher than another person who will get a job over you simply because you have that criminal record. So I agree that there's something to be looked at there. But this holus bolus we're going to decriminalize. And you know, it's funny because in the whole argument about decriminalization, I didn't hear anybody talking about what I've just said about a criminal record following you around. They've all talked about how this is necessary in order to get this problem under control, this crisis of people dying. Well, I never understood the argument that decriminalizing is going to make a difference. You know, they were saying, and we're still hearing it, we have to get rid of the stigma of drug addiction. I don't even know what that really means, but okay, let's say we got rid of the stigma. So what? Tell me something. I'm waiting. I'm waiting for all of you people out there who actually support this because you think it's going to help people who are addicted to get treatment. I ask you this. Point out one case where someone has gone into a hospital or gone to try to check into a treatment center. One instance where whoever is doing the intake at the hospital, at the treatment center, wherever, your private doctor, you go to see your private doctor, you say, Doc, I got a problem. I'm addicted. I need help. What do I do? Who do I talk to? Where do I go? Name me one instance where an addict who has taken that initiative has been reported to the police. This whole idea of drug addicts being afraid of not getting treatment because they're afraid of having a criminal record, of somebody reporting to the police, it's a red herring, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't exist. It's a fiction. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Now, I'm not going to say that the increase in the number of deaths in British Columbia is due to this whole decriminalization thing. Because, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I'm going to say that there's a strong correlation between the decriminalization and the increase in deaths. That is absolutely true. But I'm not going to go out on a limb and look at that, cherry pick those statistics and say that is proof that decriminalization leads to. I don't know that factually. But what I can say is that the data so far doesn't support the argument that decriminalization leads to a reduction in harm, a reduction in the number of deaths. And remember, we're talking just deaths here. We're not talking the number of people who have been harmed by their exposure to these toxic drugs. So what is missing? What is the real issue here? Well, to talk about the real issue, you're going to have to stick with us because we are going to have to go for a break. We went a little overtime the last time. We're just ever so slightly overtime this time. So we're going to go grab our break, and then we'll have a little bit of more substantial time to talk about this stuff on the other side. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look, I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look, I think this might be right for us, for you and me.
And we are back. Thank you very much. Oh, I needed that. I should have had that sip of water during the break, but I was caught up doing some other stuff here. Okay, back. Thanks for sticking with us. You're watching or listening to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami, and we're talking about the drug epidemic, the sharp increase, particularly in the number of deaths due to exposure to the use of toxic substances, toxic drugs in British Columbia since the decriminalization in that province, or the federal government giving the province a waiver on prosecuting crimes that have to do with personal possession of drugs or possession of drugs for personal use. All right. I'm just thinking here, what exactly is it that we need to do in order to ensure that people are getting the treatment that they need? Because really, I think that's the real problem here. There are a few things. Actually, let's back up here and let's just talk for a moment or two about the why. Why are people resorting to these substances? What is it in their lives that is missing that drug abuse, the use of drugs, fills that vacuum? That's a big question. And I don't want you to read anything into that question in terms of my personal outlook, because I don't have really an answer to that. I could speculate. I think that there's a lot of disjointedness, lack of roots, lack of family roots, the breakdown of the family, the isolation in society these days with the rise of social media. And then, of course, all of the rules that went on over the last 2.5 years with respect to COVID that really forced people to lose connection with other people. Is that a contributing factor here? I don't know. It sounds plausible to me, but I don't know for sure. What about, especially for younger people, the constant harping about the dire crisis that we are in when it comes to the environment, the idea that we're telling young people in grade 1, 2, elementary school children, kindergarten children. I had an experience with that myself earlier this week that I talked about, where kindergarten children, where young children are being exposed to the idea that the earth is broken. Now, when you're 5 years old and they tell you your world is broken, what is your reaction? We don't know what the deeper psychological, emotional consequences of feeding this kind of thing to children is. We just don't know. There are so many things going on out there. And I would throw in the abandonment in our part of the world of religion. You know, I don't have the data to put in front of you to prove this, my friends, but my sense is that when it comes to communities like the one I belong to, not just Jewish, but Orthodox Jewish, where religion plays a significant part in our life. My guess is it's the same thing amongst strong Bible-believing Christian communities, and perhaps also Muslim communities. The abandonment of religion has come with a price, I think. That's my sense. I'm not making the case. I'm not citing statistics in order to prove that what I'm saying is true. I don't have to prove anything. We're just having a discussion here, but that's my sense. So there's a lot of issues out there. There are a lot of things contributing, I think, to the increase in despair, the increase in loneliness, the increase in anxiety. I mean, we hear about all of this stuff all of the time now. You know, we look at the all of the conditions that are out there, and the argument that these conditions are contributing to an increase in teen suicide, for instance. Okay, well, why wouldn't these same things that are contributing to teen suicide, for instance, why wouldn't these also be contributing to an increase in the escapism that is attached to drug abuse? I don't know. Again, I'm just raising questions here. And I'm troubled that nobody seems to want to have that discussion. Nobody wants to anymore to talk about the breakdown in the family. Nobody wants to talk about the consequences of children being raised in one-parent families, having to do without the day-to-day significant exposure and modeling of one parent or the other. Not just single mother families, but there are such a thing as single father families as well, where the children who are growing up in that environment lack the exposure to a mother in the home. What is the result of that? You know, it just seems to me that academia, that our social scientists, if you will, seem not to be interested in studying that. And if they do, they seem to have an agenda, and the agenda is, let's find evidence that there is no evidence. Let's do a study that proves or that demonstrates that there is really no impact as a consequence of the breakdown of the natural family. And I'm going to go a step further. Not the breakdown of the natural family, the tearing down of the natural family, because that's where we are today. Families break up. That's a consequence of any society. But it just seems to me that we used to have an objective of promoting, of seeking, of aiming for intact families with biological parents that were there day in and day out for their children in the home. That's the gold standard. The fact that it doesn't always work out that way isn't a reason for us to simply abandon that as the gold standard, as the objective. But now what we've done is we're celebrating rather than despairing over the breakdown of the natural family. We're basically saying, I'm okay, you're okay. Every family structure is equally valuable, is equally effective. I don't think that that's the case. And I think that if we have honest social science, that the evidence would bear that out. But I don't think we have a lot of honest social scientists out there these days. And I certainly don't think that there's any interest amongst people to really hit the pause button and ask ourselves, what are we doing? So I think all of these things contribute to the environment where we find more and more younger people, particularly, turning to drugs as a crutch. And in this country, also, I can't let the occasion pass without making the observation that more and more people are turning to assisted suicide as a way of escaping the challenges of life. As if life is just this, supposed to be this smooth, wonderful thing that we see in fairy tales. And when you run up against problems, more and more people are taking advantage of the fact that we have government-sponsored, taxpayer-funded assisted suicide, euthanasia. And that has it's only expanded since it was implemented, and it's only going to expand further. And Canada now has become a world leader in this. It's tragic. What is contributing to this? It's not just people having difficulty making ends meet. And again, for all of the arguing that we hear about how important it is, all of the pronouncements and the pontification coming out of our politicians about how important it is for us to implement these programs, to get prices under control, to help people to make ends meet. Despite all of that rhetoric, ladies and gentlemen, our governments continue to implement policy that it makes things more expensive, either through taxes, through greater regulation. It's a tragedy. And we're not taking it seriously. So that, my friends, that is an important aspect to this whole drug epidemic discussion that needs to start to come to the surface. We need to start having honest and intelligent conversations about this stuff. But then we have this other problem. And the other problem is, what do we do for people who are addicted, who are in despair, who are looking for help? How does spending our time convincing the federal government to grant a waiver to any province, to any jurisdiction, how does decriminalization help anybody who wants help? The problem, again, ladies and gentlemen, is that there isn't enough treatment facilities. There aren't enough treatment facilities in this country. There aren't enough opportunities for people to get off of these drugs. We're all about harm reduction. Let's give out clean needles. Let's give out regulated. I told you that this is a new term now that I see injected into the debate. The problem is not opioids. The problem is unregulated toxic substances. As if to say, if only we regulate them, then the problem's going to go away. Well, the problem isn't going to go away, because the problem is not that people are dying. The problem is that they're using. If they weren't using, they wouldn't be dying. So, yeah, fine, talk about harm reduction, but not harm reduction at the expense of trying to help people get off of the drugs. That's where the treatment centers come in. But we don't spend money on treatment centers, nowhere near what we need to be. Is it because it's cheaper to just give these people drugs? It's a shame. It is. We should be, as a society, ladies and gentlemen, ashamed of ourselves that we have let the situation deteriorate to the point where the only thing that we are really seriously contemplating is finding ways to mitigate the problem Okay, we don't want them dying. That makes us feel bad. Let's give them safe drugs. The problem is that there is no such thing as safe drugs. That's just something to cleanse our conscience so that we can go to bed at night as a society, give ourselves a pat on the back, say, we're doing a great job, we're helping people. But we're not helping anyone. Not really. We're going to have to go for another break, last break of the evening, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Banami Show. And here we are again, back. It is Thursday, May the 18th, 2023, and you are tuned into the Joseph Banami Show home stretch. We only have a few minutes left in the show tonight. Thanks for sticking with us. We've been talking about, we started off talking about the opioid epidemic in British Columbia, which apparently is not really an opioid epidemic as much as it is just an epidemic in people using unregulated toxic substances. And I'm prepared to concede that point. I'm not really an expert. I haven't really looked into the precise nature of all of the drugs that are being used. So maybe it's not just opioids. Maybe it's other things as well. I'm a little disturbed by the idea of injecting now the term unregulated into the debate, because that sort of says to me that the next stage here is to start saying, well, we need to provide regulated drugs in order to help people. And, you know, in a certain very narrow sense, providing regulated, clean, if you will, safer drugs to addicts, in a sense, is going to help if the problem that you're looking at is simply illness or death. And of course, those are serious problems, okay? Don't get me wrong. But the real issue here is not how do we prevent the consequences of use of these dangerous drugs. The real question is, how do we prevent And what do we do to discourage their use in the first place? And this is actually one of the arguments, and I have never heard a good response to this yet. One of the arguments for maintaining the criminal aspect, the criminal characterization of the drugs, possession for personal use, one of the reasons why we should maintain it, that an argument that I have heard, is because that sends a message that it is bad and it is wrong to get into this stuff. I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know whether or not that argument is a valid argument. It seems on its face to me to make sense, to be a good argument. And when I look at the numbers coming out of BC right now, since decriminalization, the number of deaths that have gone up sharply, 17% this past April as opposed to last April. That's a significant increase. And it happened at the time that they decriminalized. I don't know. But it certainly is curious. In any event, ladies and gentlemen, in any event, I think that what we need to start focusing on is a policy that prevents people from using and getting addicted in the first place. And I'm not naive when I say that. I'm not prepared personally to simply throw in the towel and say they're going to do it anyway, so we might as well find a way to help them do it in a way that they're not going to die. Because that's essentially what we're doing, ladies and gentlemen. So it seems to me that our approach to drugs, to the drug epidemic, ought to be two-pronged. It ought to be, first and foremost, to find strategies to look at a way that's going to effectively discourage, if not outright prevent people from getting into the drug scene in the first place. I don't underestimate the complexity of that, the enormity of that task, but we need a strategy on that. That's number one. And number two, we need to invest our resources in increasing the capacity for dealing with people and helping them to get off of the drugs when they want to. So those are the two things. Those are the two major things I think that we need to be paying attention to. That, regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, we are not paying attention to. So that's it. That, I think, should be our drug policy right there. And if you want to talk about decriminalization, if you want to talk about a way to ensure that if a person happens to be charged with a crime and convicted as a consequence of having possession of small quantities of drugs, if you want to give an incentive, then perhaps you could say, well, if you have a criminal record, but after X number of years or whatever period of time, you get treatment, you're clean, you show that you're clean, then you can have that criminal record expunged. Not pardoned, expunged entirely. There are alternative ways of dealing with the quote-unquote stigma of criminalization, with that criminal record that would follow you around essentially for the rest of your life. There are ways to deal with it without wholesale decriminalization, which I think does send a message to society, to younger people out there, that maybe it's not such a bad thing after all. I really do think that that's the case. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Those are just my opinions. I don't know whether or not you share those opinions, but if you do, drop me a line. You can check out the website, www.josephbenamy.com. joseph.com, all one word, without a hyphen. And while you're there, by the way, you'll see there's a new thing. I have started to post some of my columns on the website, and you will see some of these are up already, some older ones. There are a lot of older ones that I have to populate on that website, and we're getting there slow but sure. But check out what some of the stuff that I have been writing about. I think you'll find that some of that is kind of interesting. Particularly this week, I posted a column on conservatives devouring one another in this country in particular. So check it out. Send me an email. Let me know what you think. And while you're there, if you've missed any episodes, you can always catch up on them by listening to the podcast. Tell your friends and neighbors about us. And please do join us on Monday night, Victoria Day, here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show, where we speak truth to power and anyone else who will listen.